We're seeing interesting protest movements all across the country and on college campuses, tens of thousands of people rallying on college campuses and in some cases setting up encampments in support of the Palestinian cause in the Middle East. Political analysts, of course, watching these protests, trying to understand the political upshot and implication of them, especially upon the presidential race. Our Washington correspondent Cassie Simeon joins us tonight. Cassie, you've been speaking with some of these analysts, and people are finding parallels between 2024, 1968, the protests of today, and those demonstrations that took over the campuses in the 60s against the Vietnam War. Now, those protests did have political implications and ramifications. What are the analysts telling you about this time around?
Well, the two experts I spoke with, Amrit, said if these protests die down over the next several months, that the campus demonstrations that we've been seeing could potentially have little to no impact on the November elections. But if they continue throughout the summer and especially around the DNC in August, it could signal problems for the president's re-election bid. Chicago, summer 1968. The Democratic National Convention was in town to nominate Vice President Hubert Humphrey for president after President Lyndon B. Johnson decided not to run for re-election. Anti-war protests raged outside the convention hall and in the city. Fast forward to 2024, with protests erupting on college campuses over the conflict between Israel and Hamas. Omar Wasso, a professor at UC Berkeley, sees parallels between then and now.
The Democratic National Convention this year is also in Chicago, and the ghosts of 1968 are absolutely casting a shadow on this upcoming convention.
Two experts we spoke with, one from the University of California at Berkeley, the other from Stanford University, agree the campus protests are more damaging to Democrats than Republicans heading into the fall.
If, in fact, there is a major disruptions at the Democratic Convention, if the campus problems fire up again in the fall, then it's bad news for the Democrats.
And that it could signal fallout similar to 1968, when the unrest widened divisions among Democrats and alienated just enough moderate and independent voters to swing a very tight election to the Republicans.
Even a few percentage points moving in a few key states was enough to tip the presidential election from the Democrat to the Republican. And so I think that's a very similar kind of situation to what we have now, where it's going to be a close election. One candidate is the candidate of law and order, and another, in Biden's case, is sort of trying to hold together a really fractious coalition.
Stanford University's Morris Fiorina told Spectrum News that while these protests could spell trouble for Biden, he believes college protests are not indicative of entire voter bloc's feelings towards the president.
Young people's main concerns are the same as older people's main concerns. They're worried about inflation. They're worried about jobs. That the people you see sort of on Stanford and UCLA and Columbia and Harvard, these are not really representative of the average student. The same thing happened in the 60s.
Now, history is a good indicator, but again, only time will tell how these protests will impact the November elections. One interesting thing that Fiorina told us during our conversation is the fact that in 1968, these protesters were protesting against the Vietnam War, where American troops were actually boots on the ground in country. In 2024, of course, American troops are not on the ground right now in the Middle East conflict. Social media, of course, is also playing a big role in how we're learning about the war and these protests across the country. So a lot of different factors coming into play here, Amrit.
There really are, Cassie. We saw some of it during the primaries, too. The protest vote in Michigan was all about this issue. Now we're seeing the actual protests. That's the top of the ticket stuff. But there's also the down ballot races. I mean, how did your analysts talk about how these protests could impact those?
Yeah, there's some real concern about this. So essentially, if protest votes happen through the November election and people decide to vote against the president or decide not to turn out at all, it could mean lower turnout for some of those down ballot races, from Senate to House races. And of course, we know turnout itself was very low in California for the primary just 2 months ago. A lot of these swing districts in California specifically, there's 6 to 7 races that could determine the makeup of the House. Those Democrats are going to be hitting the campaign trail hard to try and make sure that voters turn out in the November election, because if those Democratic voters don't turn out, it could mean Republicans take the White House, the Senate, and the House.
Thank you, Cassie, for that. Yeah, voter apathy, something that we'll be tracking very closely. Lots of polling around that recently, too. That's Cassie.